Learning how to draw isn't just about being able to produce good-looking line work. Most of it is about learning how to see. When you watch a talented draftsman sketch, it might seem as if the actual quality of lines and curves and hatching they put down on paper is what makes their drawing so believable. It seems like they just look at something or think of something and then just simply copy it on a piece of paper like magic. But the thing you don't see is the way they see things. What makes things look like the way they look like? This might sound a bit strange, but let me explain. As I mentioned in the previous video, you can draw anything by combining lines, curves, and a few basic shapes. The challenge is to understand how to place those things in relation to each other. This is where truly seeing how different things are constructed comes in. Let me give you an example. Here we have a picture of a light bulb as our reference. A very symmetrical form constructed with a few basic shapes. Let's try to draw this in a slightly larger scale. In this case, start by imagining a box against the outer limits of the object. Let me just draw that in to demonstrate. So here we have the width and height, both extremes of this object. The general shape seems to be roughly at 1:2 ratio. We can check this by drawing a diagonal line from the bottom left corner to the top right. And now, if we cross this with another diagonal, we can find the midpoint of the general shape. And we'll end up with roughly 2 squares like so. Now, already we can see that this ball shape goes slightly over the midpoint over here. And if we focus at the bottom part of this separately, it seems like the metal thread starts roughly at the midpoint of this. So if we just divide this square in half, now we can see that the plastic body of this ends slightly after halfway of the bottom part. So, by just quickly analyzing the proportions of this light bulb, we've already broken the form down to some basic rules we can follow. Now, as we want to draw a slightly bigger version of this, we just lay down our diagonal here in as much of the same angle as we possibly can and start filling in the rest based on that. The width of the metal thread seems to be about 1/3 of the object, so if we just divide this in thirds, it'll help us in placing it correctly over here. Now, this sort of grid is just to illustrate how this works. It's not something you'll have to lay down each time you draw, rather it's a way of thinking, or a way to observe things. As you get used to looking at things like this, it'll get easier for you to recognize the relationships between the different building blocks like we've done here. You can think of it as sort of a groundwork for your drawing. The more you get these right, the more resemblance you'll achieve to the original. And as you block in these main shapes, adding detail to the image becomes gradually easier since you're constantly adding more and more points of reference here. Alright, let's try this on something more complicated. Something with a bit of posture to it. With this image, I can tell right away that the banana peel is confined in this sort of triangular shape. The general form can be roughly encapsulated within 3 straight lines like this. Now we have a pretty good idea of the overall shape or posture of this, and we can start drawing and figuring out where everything goes. I'll use the same method as we did with the light bulb by making use of the surrounding edges and pinpointing the extremes of this banana peel. By dividing this edge in thirds, we can easily place the important bits on this side. The left one I'll just divide in half like so. And looks like the remaining area here, again, can be further divided in half. Now that we have our key points marked down, all we have to do is try and replicate the curves that makes this slippery skin of a fruit. Constantly glancing at the reference photo, I work through the outlines piece by piece. It's important to be especially mindful of the general angles in which things appear while doing this. Once you get to the point of adding in lines within the shape, that's when the form of it really starts to come alive. We can further enhance this illusion by adding values to the different areas. Just use whatever you're drawing with to darken the shadowy areas, and you'll notice that it makes quite a difference. As well as paying attention to the silhouette of the object, it's worth keeping an eye on the negative space too. In this case, meaning the area left between the fruit and the triangle. You can see that I could have done a better job at the bottom part here, but it's not really about copying this exactly the way it is. This kind of exercise is good for gaining confidence, and as you get better at it, you can start exaggerating things deliberately. Drawing from reference like this is great practice, as you're not only improving your technique, but also broadening your visual library at the same time. When you draw something once, it'll be easier the second time. By the time you've done it a few more times, you'll have such a strong visual image that you'll eventually be able to draw it from memory and to even draw different variations of it. Real-life reference is always better than just photos, so try to draw things you're surrounded by as often as you can. Interacting with things physically gives you much more information than just looking at them. It allows you to look at them from different perspectives and study them in much more detail. You can get a sense of how the texture feels, how much they weigh, how they move. All things that can be described in a drawing. While studying these things, try to evaluate your drawings as objectively as possible. Nailing the general proportions is important, because especially when you're drawing everyday objects or people or just things we're used to seeing on a regular basis, it can be fairly obvious if the proportions aren't quite right. It's easy to get sort of tunnel visioned when you're drawing something, and to avoid this, you can try looking at your drawings from a distance every now and then, or maybe squint your eyes to focus less on the details. As with our earlier getting started tutorial, try and keep your drawings quick while doing these exercises. Don't overinvest in any given piece, working too long on the details, but try and get the overall shape of an object down fast. Don't be too precious about them. When starting out, it takes a lot of repetitions to get things right, and by keeping the sketches fast, you can concentrate on the general proportions and form rather than spending time on finer details, which comes later in the sketching process. Everyone has their go-to topics, and whatever it is that you like to draw, it's always a good idea to step out of your comfort zone from time to time and draw all kinds of stuff. Just keep building your visual library. For example, if you're into drawing mech robots, being familiar with both heavy-duty machinery and anatomy will work in your favor. The more you study things and how they look like, the easier it becomes for you to produce believable drawings from your imagination. Sometimes it might be tempting to skip this part of learning and just trace the image you want to draw. Especially with digital platforms, it's so easy to just underlay a photo, follow the outlines, and move straight into coloring and rendering, etc. And the results might be fine and all, but it isn't really getting you anywhere if you want to create something original. Also, when you simply trace over an image, you're not actually studying those things like we did before, and it won't really improve your draftsmanship. Instead of tracing, you can pick up a light marker or a pencil and block things out a bit before committing to the line work. This way, you can figure out the structure beforehand and focus on the outlines afterwards. It's rough, and you can continue to make changes to it early on, but most importantly, it forces you to understand the subject you're drawing. Having said all this, there are situations where tracing photos is kind of expected. When you're drawing against a clock, sometimes it's simply much quicker to produce some imagery like this. For example, it's common practice for designers to use storyboards to sell concept ideas, and instead of drawing the people from scratch, they might snap a few photos of their teammates and move on from there. Product designers often build sketch models to evaluate ideas in a physical form before committing to things like scale and materials any further. Photos of these are great reference for refining the design on paper and figuring out design details. When you draw as a part of your profession, drawings have different functions, and most often they're meant to convey ideas, and they're meant to convey those ideas fast. So, in order to create new things, you'll have to be able to visualize your ideas somehow. Most of the time when creating a product, building, service, or whatever it might be, there are other people involved. And this is where communicating your ideas visually becomes so important. It's much easier to collaborate and to grasp complex ideas when you can actually look at them and point things out. Drawing from reference is a good place to start honing those visualization skills. You'll sort of have to learn the rules before you break them, if that makes sense. And this stuff doesn't happen overnight, but if you got the passion for it, it's the right place to start practicing. Take your time, figure things out, and don't be discouraged if you can't get the results you're after right away. Alright. In case you're having trouble coming up with drawing subjects, I've collected a set of photos for you just to get started with. Just tap the link in the description and you can download them on whichever device you choose. If you found this useful, leave a thumbs up, and to make sure you're not missing out, subscribe for more. And hit the bell button if you want to get notified. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.